AWS is here, and he's going to talk to us more about open source licensing. And he's going to talk about getting beyond zero-sum and open source. So Matt, are you there?
I am.
Ah, lovely. Wonderful.
Okay. Can I go?
You can go. You're up.
Awesome. Awesome. And it feels kind of awesome to follow after MySQL. Very grateful for the work that they've done for 25 years. It's kind of amazing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I want to talk about, mine's going to be less technical, less product oriented or project oriented, and more about how we as an industry or how we as a community of communities get away from thinking about open source zero-sum games. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I'm not going to talk about AWS per se, but I'm going to talk about industry trends and where we all fit in this. So without further ado, and let's get started. So to get started, I need to give a very brief history of open source. And incidentally, you'll see obligatory ski pictures as I go because I love to ski. And yes, I am still skiing, socially distant skiing in Utah. But I think it's useful to get a little bit of background on open source, how we've gotten to this point. I promise it won't be boring. And if it is boring, I promise it will be short. The first place to start with is long before there was the open source as a term, as a phrase, which of course was coined in February 1998, there was the concept of open source. It was very much alive. And if you think back, and this is a picture of Grace Hopper, if you think back to the 60s, 70s, the idea of open source was very much alive. And it was that, but at that time, it was that the companies like IBM would sell hardware and the software was more or less given away. And I don't want to say that it was an afterthought or that it was unimportant. It's just not what was sold. And especially in academics, it was very much the case that one university, one researcher would take the software, make tweaks to suit her needs, and then share it. And that was the norm. It wasn't an aberration. That was how software was distributed and used. Fast forward a few years to 98, and that spirit of sharing that was coined as open source. Throughout all that time, this concept of developers sharing with each other has persisted. And just want to make sure that I forgot to start my timer. So keep that in mind, but I want to make it a little bit more personal. And to make it more personal, I want to talk about 3 developers and 3 projects over the last few decades that have arisen. And the first one is SolveSpace, and the maintainer, her name is Whitequark. I don't actually know her name, but she goes by Whitequark online. It's licensed under GPL v3. SolveSpace is parametric 3D CAD or computer assisted drawing. Basically, it's the software that you'd use if you had a 3D printer and you wanted to build something. You might use this 3D CAD program, SolveSpace or another one, before to design and to tune your machine to know what to build. For Whitequark, when I asked her, I interviewed her recently, and I asked her, what got you into this? She said, well, you know, I build very boring, these are her words, very boring technical parts. And why? Because making physical things is cool. I know most of us are probably on the software side. She's as much on the software side as she is on the hardware side. And when she started in roughly around 2014, she started looking for again, a 3D CAD program that she could use. But she was constrained by a few different criteria. One was not that it had to be open source. She actually didn't care. She says she's not a purist. But she needed something that was relatively cheap. She needed something that ran on Linux. And she needed something, and this is where we get out of my pay grade, that did parametric modeling and NURBS Booleans. The important thing here is that this narrowed the field considerably. She evaluated a few different options and ultimately settled on SolveSpace. The problem was, as she said, it was a legacy code base that was extremely challenging to work with for anyone who wasn't its original author, as I quickly realized by discovering that many of my earliest obvious looking changes were in fact unsound. So what would any serious open source developer do with this? They did what she did. She started to contribute. She contributed first just trying to make the infrastructure or the scaffolding of SolveSpace more sound. It got to the point where she was valued so highly that she was made the maintainer of the project by the original founder and maintainer of the project. She continues to maintain it to this day. But again, a good example of how open source can work. She wanted something solved. She had an itch to scratch, as it were. She got involved. She started to contribute. And today is the lead designer or the lead maintainer. In fact, one thing about Whitequark that I find particularly inspiring is she cared so much about it. She recognized that they needed a graphic design person to work on the project. They didn't have one. And so she actually took on contract work so that she could pay somebody to do this work. Kind of amazing, going above and beyond. Now, SolveSpace is a relatively small project. Compare that with Drupal and the founder Dries Buytaert, and Drupal's slightly bigger. Last year, in 2019, Drupal had roughly 10,000 individual contributors, which is sort of mind-blowing if you think about it. These contributors might include, and do include, developers at Pfizer, for example. Pfizer contributes millions of dollars of engineering time each year so that it could build, for example, a workflow engine that benefits everyone who uses Drupal, including their top competitor, Johnson & Johnson, or one of their top competitors. The spirit of open source. Now, when I interviewed Dries for this, he told me that it wasn't always this way. It's this huge community now, but it wasn't always that way. It started with Dries wanting to build, as he calls it, a very little website, so that he was at I think at the University of Antwerp in Belgium, and was just crazed with this idea of the internet and building websites. But he didn't have an internet connection, or at least not a fast one. His friend, however, did have an ADSL connection, which today would be very slow, but at the time was quite fast, could handle up to 10 users. But there was a requirement that they couldn't share, that he was not allowed to share that connection. So what did he do? Well, they immediately started trying to figure out how to share that connection. Dries became an early contributor to the Linux kernel on the wireless LAN stuff, and they figured out how to share it. And he built this website that allowed users of this ADSL connection to coordinate how they were going to do it, and eventually became coordinate when they're going to go to McDonald's or meet up at the pub. But it started with this very little act of sharing, and eventually got to the point where Dries says, hey, you know, people were lobbing in all these support requests saying, hey, it would be great if Drupal, as it came to be called, could do X, Y, or Z. And he said, well, maybe you should contribute that. He said he bent over backwards, wrapping, as he said, a warm blanket around these contributors to enable them to give back to Drupal. The super interesting thing about Drupal in all this, to this day, so 7 years, he kind of worked on this as a labor of love, nights and weekends as he finished his PhD, came to this decision point where he had to decide, what am I going to do with my life? He said the easy choice would have been to stay in academia, decided instead to start a company, Acquia, with Jay Batson. And now, today, Acquia is one of the primary contributors to Drupal. And if you think about the way that we think of commercial open source today, you say, oh, they must contribute most of Drupal. In fact, they contribute less than 5% of Drupal, to the point that he says, now Dries thinks about commercial and open source very differently from many today. He says, with so many of the open source companies, they're very insecure. They want to be in control. The thought of not having absolute control over the product, the roadmap, etc., is, quote, foreign to them. It's the craziest thing in their minds. So Dries has decided to do open source in a very different way, which I would argue is the original way of sharing. And the benefit to everyone is that this Drupal community of 10,000 or so contributors is that that's filled with all sorts of companies and people who benefit from Drupal. All right, last one, Redis and Salvatore Sanfilippo, who incidentally looks like he should be like a GQ model or something. Should have had Salvatore on here, and everyone would like looking at him a lot more than they like looking at me. Salvatore's story is also super interesting because he wasn't trying to start a company. There is a fantastic company now backing Redis called Redis Labs, but that wasn't where he started. He started just needing a database that would scale to meet his meet an analytics application within his company, meet his needs for that. MySQL met the needs, but was too expensive for him to scale. So based on his needs, he said it just wasn't cost effective for him to use MySQL. So instead, he started developing this in-memory database, which the database experts at the time said, this is crazy. Why would you put that in memory? And there were a number of other things where, again, the database experts, who weren't wrong for the state of where databases were at the time, but they were wrong for where databases were going. Salvatore, in his, quote, ignorance, persisted and created one of the top today, one of the most popular databases on the planet. If you look at DB engines, I think it's maybe ranked number 7 right now, but at any rate, super popular. One of the things that's really worked for Salvatore and Redis is that he doesn't try to guide how people use Redis. I asked him, well, what's the best thing? What are the best use cases for Redis? And his response was, what Redis is good for is not my choice. It's the application developer that knows best. This has enabled a vibrant community to grow up around Redis. And he says it's important because different users bring different experiences, want to solve different problems. And so they bring that expertise and those needs to Redis and make it better. He said, having said that, you tend to only get serious contributions, his words, only from folks that are paid to write such contributions most of the time. Turns out it's hard to develop a database if you really need to be able to invest a lot of time in it. So those who offer the quote unquote best contributions tend to be paid to do that. But he says the Redis core is definitely a collaboration between many individuals. So of course, during this time of Peace, Love, and Redis, Drupal, and SolveSpace, other forces have been at work in software. To the left is Bill Gates' famous 1976 open letter to the hobbyists, where he says, most of you steal your code, you prevent great software from being written, pay up, was kind of the thrust of what he says. But this isn't to say that Bill Gates started this trouble in paradise, or this idea of selling software licenses and turning software into property. Remember, back in the 60s, 70s, software wasn't sold, the hardware was sold, and software was mostly given away. Throughout this time, through 1976, and then on to 98, and then on to today, lots of sharing and collaboration has happened. But this idea of locking down software and it being a scarce resource started to arise. To the point in 2005, I joined a company, Alfresco, great company, but this was the rise of the open core movement, where open source software companies, in order to, I don't want to put a pejorative slant on it, but compel users to become customers, kept some software back and said, hey, you know what, for example, if you want to use this core of the software, it's great, works great. But if you need advanced security, you have to buy the enterprise version. If you need If you have more than 100 users, you need to buy this enterprise version. So it's this infiltration of open source with the old model of proprietary software, to the point that more recently, in the last few years, some of these companies just gave up on open source altogether and started using licenses that weren't OSI approved, weren't open source licenses. This isn't to cast aspersions on anyone, but it is to bring up something, one of my favorite things, Pi. When I bring up this history and I bring up this proprietization of open source, because I think we're missing something fundamentally important in all of this, and that is Pi. It's not really about the number of pies. This is, I like to make pie, and I made for my team one year a number of different pies, but it's not really about the number of pies. It's about how big you make the pie. So let's do some pie-related math. For those watching at home, which is all of you, check me on my math, because I was a literature major, so my math is not always great. But Gartner's done this math and said, this was 2 years ago, or about a year ago, really. Gartner said that open source is roughly 10% of the now $46 billion database market. Pretty good, right? At one time, it was 0%, so it's pretty good. But it's still a small fraction of the database market. Let's broaden beyond databases and talk to the global IT market. That's a $3.9 trillion market. Awesome. Cloud spending within that is roughly 266 billion. Now, again, I'm a literature major. I also went to law school, did a master's in international relations, none of which qualifies me to do this math, but you can check my math. I think what this means, if you look at these numbers, I think what it means is that we spend a lot of time arguing over 6% of the total IT market. We spend a lot of time pointing fingers at cloud vendors, or it's not just the cloud, but we spend a lot of times pointing fingers at these different vendors saying, you're taking from me, but we're talking about 6%. We're talking about almost a rounding error of the overall IT market. And maybe more importantly, as we carve up this little tiny pie, we're thinking about it, I think, wrong. So MySQL preceded me in this, now Oracle, of course, but Martin Mikos, former CEO of MySQL and a good friend of mine, used to say this, and I remember distinctly when he said this. I loved it at the time, because as an open source guy, I loved this idea of sticking it to the man, and the man at that time was the company that now owns MySQL. But at any rate, he said the relational database is a $9 billion a year market. Not sure where he got that number, but let's stick with him. I want to shrink it to 3 billion and take $1 billion of that. Now, they did take $1 billion in terms of selling to Sun for $1 billion, MySQL. But his idea is sort of deflationary, that open source takes money and shrinks markets. The only problem with this view, one, it potentially means a lot less pie for everyone. And I like pie, so I don't like the idea of rinky-dink little pies. But I also think Martin, who's exceptionally smart, I think he just happened to get this wrong. Or maybe he was looking for a good soundbite, and let's face it, it is a good soundbite. He's wrong because of Jevon, who had a paradox, Jevon's paradox. Simon Wardley, who many of you will have heard of or possibly know, talks a lot about Jevon's paradox. And the basic idea of Jevon's paradox is that instead of lower per unit costs leading to a reduction in overall spend, or a smaller overall market, because people pocket the savings and think about it, pocket the savings. Instead, the irony or the paradox is that we actually tend to spend more. We save money, and it means we buy more things. There's a variety of reasons for this, including there's this long tail of unmet expectations or new applications. This is something that I saw when I was at MySQL or at MongoDB. There were applications being built with MongoDB, a document style database, that simply could not be built with Oracle. Not because there's anything wrong with Oracle, not because there's anything wrong with SQL Server or MySQL, but simply because it was a different kind of database that enabled new kinds of applications. So that's one reason that we see as people save money with open source, as they save money with cloud, they're not contracting their spending. They're actually spending more or getting more value for the same amount, but they're not reducing spending. It's this Jevon's paradox. At the same time, think about this with respect to, and I don't have a great word for this, but these big web applications or web companies, think Google, Amazon, Facebook. None of these, open source made these applications, made these companies possible. And it's not really about some punitive per unit license fee. Maybe that's part of it. Part of it also is that just keeping tabs, if you've got thousands or tens of thousands or millions of servers, keeping tabs on whether you're up to date on your licenses before the audit comes. I mean, there's part of it that's that too, but a big part of it is just the flexibility of open source that enabled all of these new kinds of applications. So, Jevon, paradox, open source and cloud didn't kill spending. Cloud has not killed open source. If anything, it's accelerated and grown it. We're looking at the opportunity to have a lot more pie. Let's talk a little bit about why. I mean, at this point, you might be saying, you know, Matt, that's fine. You work for AWS. Of course, you're going to say that. Of course, you're going to say that cloud is not cannibalizing open source, and you're an open source guy. So of course, you're going to say that open source is a net positive. And the answer is to both questions, sure. But that bias existed before I joined. It's why I joined. And that bias for open source also has existed for decades, because that's how I've chosen to spend my career. And I don't think for this crowd, actually, open source is a difficult thing to embrace. But something has been on my mind since AWS reInvent last year. And that is this idea of how do we grow the pie for everyone? And it started with a conversation with a good friend from MongoDB. AWS had just released the day before, at that time, well, it's now called Amazon Key Spaces. It's our managed Cassandra service. And I remember reading a tweet where someone said, you guys are doing this and you're just trying to take all of DataStax's revenue, which seemed a little bit odd to me. And I said this to my friend, my friend from MongoDB. I said, you know, with all due respect, I have friends at DataStax, great company, and now I have really close friends at DataStax since Sam Ramji joined. But we could take 100, at the time, AWS is at I think a $36 billion run rate. We could take 100% of the revenue and it wouldn't move the needle for us. And that's not really how we think. We really do, and this is actually true, we really do obsess over how to deliver customer value. I said, so they've got it wrong. We're not trying to carve up a little tiny pie. We need to figure out how to make this pie bigger. And talking again with this friend, it occurred to me and to us, I think both, that there's actually two phases. The first phase is, how do we make this pie? How do we make the open source pie bigger and better for everyone? Because again, the enemy is not, we're not trying to carve up a $4.6 billion database market. There's another 46 billion or another 41 billion or so. And actually it's bigger than that, because there's a lot of money that's not being spent. The customers are having unmet needs that we could be driving to. So it's not about carving up the existing pie. It's how do we make the pie bigger for Kafka, for Apache Cassandra, Apache Kafka, for Redis, for MongoDB, Elastic. Name your different open source project. How do we make that bigger? And the second phase is, yeah, we're going to compete like hell to win those workloads, but that's a secondary concern. And we're going to do it with cloud. And let's get into that. The first one, phase one, is let's together make open source even more awesome. And how do we do that? Well, we contribute. One thing to recognize in this, and Kyle Matthews, founder of Gatsby.js, said this really well. When I was interviewing him recently, he talked about how Gatsby is built on React and depends on GraphQL and all these other open source projects. Could not exist without them. Well, guess what? That's all of us. We are all net consumers of open source. Not one of us even remotely comes close to contributing 1/10 or 1/100th or 1/1000th of what we benefit from open source. We need to recognize that. Second is that users, especially users who figure out how to operationalize code, are actually really valuable to us. And again, I know you're saying, Matt, you're saying that because you work for AWS. Yeah, I work for AWS because I think it's true. Operations really matters. Users really matters. Rich Felker of the MuscleLibC projects had this, a founder of it, had this great comment where he said, users, testers, adopters, bug reporters are so much more valuable than writing any code because it shows him what kind of code he needs to write. Now, take that with a grain of salt. We don't all want to have just net users, and Jens Axbo said this to me of the FIO project, that no, users who can contribute back are even better. They need to be using, then they need to be contributing back because that use informs the kind of things that they would contribute. Remember also Salvatore's comment that most people aren't going to be able to contribute to our projects. They just aren't because they don't have the time. They're not paid to do it. And frankly, they're using 1,000 different projects. They can't contribute to all 1,000. So maybe they choose to contribute to this one or that one. We need to be a little bit patient with each other as we grow the pie. And so that's the message here is let's make the pie bigger. Let's be patient with each other as we do it. We all have constraints that impede us from contributing. We also have different ways in which we contribute. I'm trying to remember, I think it was Jens who said to me recently that he's great at writing software. He's really crappy at writing documentation. So one of the things that probably lots of people listening on this call, to this presentation could do is contribute more documentation. That's something that every project needs. Once we've made the pie bigger, then let's compete. And let's compete in the way that customers are increasingly choosing to consume software, and that's cloud. And guess what? This isn't just AWS cloud. This is at Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, DigitalOcean, but not just that. In the database space, in this world in which we live, it's MongoDB's Atlas, for example. In fact, let me stop on Atlas for a second, because I think it's a great example. My personal belief is that license changes at MongoDB and other companies have not really helped them at all. I was at MongoDB for a few years, and licensing really didn't drive sales. That's not the way the customers were thinking. What customers are looking for is value. Once MongoDB introduced Atlas, it's amazing if you can go back and look at their earnings calls, the progress that went from 10% of their revenue, 11% of the revenue derived from Atlas to 20% to today, it's 41%. Atlas, MongoDB's database as a service is I think on a $400 million run rate. It's a $100 million quarter business. It's awesome. It's so cool. They're doing such a great job. They're doing a great job of delivering value to customers. Cloud is the way that customers increasingly want to consume their software. And so you look at now at whether it's Percona or MariaDB or Redis Labs or name all these different Couchbase, all of these different companies are delivering databases as a service, as a cloud service. It's exactly what they should be doing. That's exactly how we should be competing, not competing to keep value back, but competing to bring value to customers. And I think that's what cloud does. Which brings us to that conclusions. If you start with a customer and work backward, as kind of an AWS, Amazon sort of thing to say, open source and cloud are going to be key components of how we deliver value to customers. So let's do it. And let's not just do it in our individual silos. Let's do it together. Because again, there's going to be competition at the cloud level, but at the project level, at the open source level, there should be widespread, rampant collaboration. It's exactly what we should be doing. Along the way, let's be sure to remember the Whitequarks, the Drieses, the Salvatores. Let's make sure we contribute more, all of us. We all consume more than we contribute, but we can all do better in contributing. It's about abundance. It's not about scarcity. We all want more pie. And if you don't think you like pie, it's because you haven't had good pie yet. I can take care of that. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.